November 18th, 1942. The skies above Guadalcanal shimmered with tropical heat. Down below, Henderson Field buzzed with anxious energy. Up above, a lone Japanese Zero pilot tightened his grip on the control stick. He had fought since China. He had trusted in his aircraft, the famed Zero, the undefeated champion of the Pacific. Yet today, something new climbed into his sky. 2 engines, twin tails, a strange silhouette that seemed almost alien. Bombers? He wondered. No, too fast, too steep a climb. His breath caught as he realized the truth. These were American fighters, but not like any he had faced before. That morning, pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron rose in their P-38 Lightnings for the first time against Japanese opposition. What happened next would shatter a myth 3 years in the making, the myth of Japanese air supremacy. For the first time, a Zero pilot felt the cold weight of doubt. Could his aircraft, once untouchable, now be outclimbed, outrun, outgunned? This is not just the story of a new airplane. It is the story of a clash between 2 worlds, the spirit of the warrior versus the power of industry, the art of the dogfight versus the science of altitude and speed. It is the moment when courage met technology, and technology rewrote the rules of war. In this journey, we'll uncover how a fighter that many once dismissed as too heavy, too strange, too complicated, became the weapon that broke the backbone of Japan's aerial empire. We'll meet the pilots who first faced the twin-tailed devil, the engineers who dared to build it, and the commanders who realized too late that the age of the Zero had ended. So let us begin where the legend of the Lightning was born, above a blood-soaked island in the Pacific, when, for the first time, the hunter became the hunted. 1. Shock over Guadalcanal. The day air superiority cracked. The morning air over Henderson Field carried the smell of fuel, dust, and nervous anticipation. The ground crews of the 339th Fighter Squadron worked with practiced rhythm, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, wiping sweat from their brows as the sun climbed higher. On this day, November 18th, 1942, the Americans prepared to test a new machine in real combat. A machine that many still doubted, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Across the water, Japanese pilots had grown accustomed to a certain rhythm of war. They had faced the Wildcat, the P-40, the Buffalo. All of them had fallen in turning fights. The Zero reigned supreme, and every man in the cockpit of a Mitsubishi A6M carried that confidence like armor. When they spotted the strange twin-tailed shapes lifting from Henderson, they didn't feel fear. They felt curiosity. Bombers? Some thought. Perhaps reconnaissance craft? But curiosity turned to unease as the Lightnings climbed faster than anything they had ever seen, straight up from sea level, as if pulled by invisible hands toward the clouds. One Japanese pilot later admitted that in that instant the certainty of victory cracked. His Zero strained, but the twin-engined fighters were already above him, diving back down with thunder in their guns. That day, 3 Japanese aircraft were claimed by the P-38 seconds. The number was not overwhelming, but the symbolism was. For the first time, the Zero could not dictate the terms of battle. It could not climb to meet its enemy. It could not dance on its own terms. The air war over the Pacific had tilted, ever so slightly, in America's favor. The lesson here is simple but profound. In combat, confidence is as much a weapon as guns or engines. The Japanese pilots carried the confidence of past victories, but technology has a way of exposing false certainties. When the Lightning rose above Guadalcanal, it was more than an aircraft. It was proof that innovation could turn doubt into dominance. And this was only the beginning. The shock of that November day set the stage for a much larger story. To truly understand why this moment mattered, we need to step back and ask, how did the Zero become a symbol of invincibility in the first place? That story begins years earlier, in China, at Pearl Harbor, and across the Pacific, where the legend of the samurai in the sky was first born. 2. The Zero myth. Birth of the samurai in the sky. Before the Lightning ever roared over Guadalcanal, the Pacific skies belonged to a different legend. Its name was whispered with both fear and admiration. The Mitsubishi A6M0. In 1940, the Zero burst into combat over China, where Allied pilots quickly discovered something unsettling. The fighter could turn inside almost anything they flew. It had astonishing range, nearly 2,000 miles, allowing it to appear where it was least expected. At Pearl Harbor, Zeros danced through the sky while American defenders struggled to keep pace. In the Philippines, Singapore, and Burma, it was the same story. Hurricanes, Buffaloes, and P-40 Warhawks fell victim to its tight turns and disciplined pilots. One man, Saburo Sakai, became the very embodiment of this legend. By the time he reached New Guinea in 1942, he was already credited with more than a dozen victories. His confidence was unshakable. For Sakai and his comrades, the Zero was not just a machine, it was a samurai's sword, sharp and unstoppable. But myths are powerful precisely because they simplify reality. The Zero's secret was not magic. Its designers had stripped it of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to achieve lightness. The pilots flying it were veterans, hardened by years of combat in China, trained in long and rigorous programs. Together, these factors created the illusion of invincibility. The small lesson here is clear. When strength is built on sacrifice, it often comes with hidden costs. The Zero achieved agility by giving up protection. It won early victories because of elite pilots, not endless reserves. These weaknesses remained, but in the first year of war, they were invisible beneath the glare of triumph. And so, by mid-1942, Japanese commanders believed their dominance unshakable. They assumed American pilots would always fly heavier, slower, less agile aircraft. They believed courage and skill alone would secure victory. What they did not anticipate was that across the ocean, Lockheed engineers were crafting something entirely different, an aircraft born not from tradition, but from a radical new philosophy of design. And that is where our story turns. From the myth of the samurai's blade to the forging of a twin-tailed devil that would change the very meaning of air combat. 3. Designing a devil. How Lockheed built the Lightning. While Japanese engineers chased lightness and maneuverability, a very different vision was unfolding in Burbank, California. In 1937, the U.S. 20th Army Air Corps issued a daring challenge: design a fighter that could fly faster than 400 miles per hour, climb higher than 40,000 feet, and travel over 1,000 miles without refueling. To many, it sounded impossible. To one young engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson, it sounded like an invitation to create something revolutionary. Johnson and his team at Lockheed sketched out a radical shape: 2 slender booms for twin engines, joined by a central pod where the pilot sat. It looked more like a science fiction experiment than a fighter. But beneath that unusual silhouette was genius: 2 turbo, supercharged Allison engines that could maintain power at altitude, hydraulics that made controls responsive at high speed, and a concentrated nose armament for 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon that fired in a single stream. No more calculating convergence angles like wing-mounted guns. Point. Shoot. Destroy. When the first prototype, the XP-38, flew in 1939, test pilots knew they had something extraordinary. On a cross-country flight, the Lightning set a new speed record before crashing on landing due to icing, an early reminder that innovation always carries risk. The lesson here is subtle but profound. Great leaps in design often look strange at first. Many dismissed the Lightning as too heavy, too complex, too awkward to ever work. Even some American officers doubted it. But Kelly Johnson believed that speed, altitude, and firepower could rewrite the rulebook of air combat. By late 1942, the P-38 was arriving in the Pacific. It wasn't perfect, its systems were complicated, its cockpit could be cold at high altitude, and compressibility in dives made recovery dangerous. Yet every month, new refinements rolled off assembly lines: dive, recovery flaps, boosted ailerons, better heating. The Lightning was not just a fighter, it was a machine that could evolve faster than its enemy. And soon, the pilots of the 339th Squadron would discover just how powerful this evolution could be. Because the Lightning was no longer just an experiment, it was about to face the Zero in the crucible of real combat. And that brings us back to Guadalcanal. For Japanese aviators, the Zero's supremacy seemed eternal. For American pilots, the Lightning was untested, unproven. The question hung in the air: what would happen when myth met machine? The answer came in their very first clash. 4. First encounters: confusion, panic, and adaptation. Imagine the cockpit of a Zero over the Solomon Islands in late 1942. The pilot has flown dozens of missions. He knows the rhythm of combat: spot the enemy, dive in, turn tighter, outfly them, and return a victor. But on this day, the rhythm breaks. As the Japanese formation approaches, their eyes catch the strange silhouette of twin tails rising rapidly from Henderson Field. At first, they dismiss it. Probably bombers. But then the climb rate tells a different story. Within minutes, the Lightnings are not below them, but above, poised like hawks. The P-38 seconds dive with speed the Zero cannot match, their concentrated nose guns spewing deadly streams of fire. On that November 18th mission, the 339th Fighter Squadron claimed 3 kills. For the Japanese, the number was small, but the shock was immense. They realized, for the first time, that the initiative in the air could be taken from them. Their legendary turning ability meant nothing when the fight began at 25,000 feet, far above their comfort zone. One pilot later described it simply: they came from nowhere, they struck like thunder, and then they were gone. The Americans, too, learned valuable lessons. Pilots who had struggled in P-40 seconds understood now that they no longer had to fight on Japanese terms. They didn't need to turn tighter. They just had to climb higher, dive faster, and strike smarter. The P-38 gave them permission to fight with brains, not bravado. The small lesson here is timeless. Confusion can be deadly, but it can also be the beginning of adaptation. For the Japanese, that confusion exposed a weakness in doctrine. For the Americans, it showed that victory lay not in mimicking the enemy's style, but in forcing him to face a new one. And so, the first blood over Guadalcanal was more than a skirmish. It was the start of a transformation. The Zero, once untouchable, was now vulnerable. The Lightning, once doubted, was now feared. But the true test of this new reality was still to come. Months later, in one of the most daring missions of the war, the Lightning would be asked to do the impossible, to fly farther, faster, and with more precision than any fighter before it on a mission that would shake the Japanese Navy to its core. 5th, Operation Vengeance, America's Qua 120th Mile Gamble, April 18, 1943. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath 16 P-38 Lightnings, flying so low their propellers seemed to skim the waves. The mission they carried was unlike any in history: intercept and kill Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, while he inspected Japanese bases in the Solomon Islands. The plan bordered on impossible. The Lightnings had to fly 435 miles from Guadalcanal to the precise point and time of Yamamoto's arrival. Every gallon of fuel, every minute of flight had been calculated. They carried drop tanks, navigated with only a compass and stopwatch, and trusted their leader, Major John Mitchell, to bring them to the exact spot. If they were early, they risked being detected. If they were late, Yamamoto would already be gone. At 9:34 a.m., just as planned, black dots appeared on the horizon. Yamamoto's flight, 2 Betty bombers and 6 Zero escorts. The Lightnings climbed suddenly, releasing their drop tanks. Captain Thomas Lanphier rolled into a diving attack. Seconds later, Yamamoto's Betty bomber spiraled into the jungle. The most revered Japanese naval commander was dead. For the Japanese, it was a psychological earthquake. If even Yamamoto, guarded by elite pilots, could be hunted down in the open sky, then nowhere was safe. For the Americans, it was proof of what the Lightning could do: range beyond expectation, precision beyond belief, and lethality at the moment of truth. The lesson here is that wars are not only won by courage, they are won by preparation. Operation Vengeance succeeded because of meticulous planning, navigational discipline, and the P-38's unique endurance. The mission showed that technology and teamwork could accomplish what bravery alone never could. And it also revealed something deeper. This was not just about aircraft performance, it was about philosophy. Japan trusted in spirit and tradition. America trusted in systems and science. The clash between those two approaches was about to grow sharper, as pilots on both sides adapted to the realities of a new kind of air war. Next, we'll see how tactics themselves began to change, how American pilots rewrote the very grammar of aerial combat, and how Japanese aviators struggled to answer maneuvers they had never been trained to fight. 6. Tactics that rewrote the rulebook. After Guadalcanal and the Yamamoto mission, one truth was clear. The P-38 Lightning gave American pilots the chance to fight on their own terms. But having the right machine was only half the story. The other half was learning to use it in ways that completely rewrote the grammar of aerial combat. In World War I and the early Pacific battles, dogfighting meant turning contests. The Zero had been built for that very stage: tight circles, low speeds, duels of patience and nerve. But the Lightning was not designed to dance in circles. It was designed to strike like a hammer. American pilots adopted a method called boom and zoom. From high altitude, they would dive at incredible speed, fire a burst of concentrated nose guns, then climb steeply back to safety before the Zero could turn and respond. The Lightning's twin engines gave it the thrust to climb back fast. The Zero, heavy on the stick above 250 miles per hour, could only flounder. Pilots like Richard Bong practiced this until it became second nature. He would often describe how the key was patience: wait for the right angle, dive with precision, and trust that the Lightning's speed would carry you out before danger closed in. Gun camera footage showed it in stark detail. Zeros breaking apart under concentrated fire, unable to follow as the Lightning zoomed back toward the clouds. The Japanese tried to adapt. They experimented with looser formations to spot high-altitude attacks. They even attempted to lure P-38 seconds into turning contests near the deck. Occasionally, when an American misjudged and stayed too long in the fight, the Zero could still take its victim, but increasingly, the old tricks failed. A new era of energy fighting using altitude, speed, and teamwork was taking hold. The small lesson here is this: technology only matters when paired with the right mindset. A powerful aircraft in the hands of a pilot fighting the wrong way is just as vulnerable as any other. But when Americans embraced the Lightning's strengths, they weren't just flying differently, they were redefining what air combat meant. And this evolution was more than tactical. It was educational. Because while Japan struggled to replace its shrinking cadre of elite pilots, America was building a training system that produced professionals by the hundreds, men ready not only to fly the Lightning, but to master it. That is where our story turns next. The widening gap in training, where one nation poured hours and science into its pilots, and the other, drained by losses, sent boys into combat with barely enough time to learn the controls. 7. Training gap. Professionals versus sacrificial lambs. Picture two young men in 1943. One is an American cadet in Arizona, climbing into a trainer under a wide desert sky. The other is a Japanese recruit in Kyushu, strapping into a Zero for the very first time. Both dream of glory. Both will soon face each other over the Pacific. But the journeys that brought them to the cockpit could not be more different. In America, training was long and methodical. A cadet might spend 400 to 600 hours in the air before ever seeing combat. He practiced formation flying, engine-out procedures, gunnery with camera guns, high-altitude oxygen drills, even survival training in case he went down at sea. By the time he climbed into a P-38, he was not only confident in his machine, he was confident in himself. In Japan, the reality by 1943 was stark. Heavy losses in the Solomons and New Guinea meant veterans like Saburo Sakai were irreplaceable. Training pipelines were shortened from years to mere months. Some pilots logged fewer than 100 hours before being sent into combat. Ammunition was scarce, so live-fire gunnery was often cut short. Many had never fired a full burst before facing Americans in battle. The result was tragic. One Japanese officer later recalled watching green pilots struggle to take off from Rabaul, only to be cut down on their first mission. He said, "We were no longer sending warriors. We were sending sacrifices." Meanwhile, American Lightning pilots built experience quickly. Squadrons shared film from their gun cameras, studying every mistake and every success. Veterans taught newcomers how to dive and climb, when to engage and when to break away. Each lesson passed down meant fewer lives lost, more victories gained. The small lesson here is powerful. Courage without preparation becomes waste. Japan still had brave pilots, but bravery alone could not replace training. America's investment in time, fuel, and discipline created professionals. Japan's shortage created victims. And soon, that gap widened even further, not only in training, but in the very systems that kept aircraft flying. Because in war, it is not only the pilot who matters. It is also the mechanic, the spare parts, the ability to keep planes in the sky day after day. That brings us to the next chapter of the Lightning's story. Maintenance, reliability, and the hidden advantage of two engines that gave American pilots both confidence and survival. 8. Maintenance, reliability, and the twin-engine advantage. War in the Pacific was not fought from spotless hangars. It was fought from muddy airstrips carved out of jungle, with mechanics working under monsoon rains, salty winds, and the ever-present buzz of mosquitoes. Yet somehow, the American P-38 squadrons kept their aircraft flying day after day. The secret was not just in the design, it was in the people and the systems that supported it. The Lightning's twin engines gave it a unique kind of resilience. Many times, pilots returned home on just one engine, limping across miles of open ocean. Stories circulated of Lightnings shot full of holes, yet still able to bring their pilots back to Henderson Field or Port Moresby. Each one became a kind of legend, proof to nervous young flyers that the P-38 would not abandon them easily. Behind the scenes, maintenance crews worked miracles. Drawn from America's vast pool of automobile and aviation workers, they brought a systematic approach, specialized tools, standardized checklists, preventive inspections. A damaged P-38 could often be patched up in days, not weeks. Mission-capable rates hovered above 80%, even in primitive conditions. Contrast that with Japanese units at Rabaul or Truk. Flying simpler, single-engine Zeros, they often struggled to keep half their aircraft operational. Spare parts were scarce, engines wore out quickly, and mechanics lacked the industrial supply chain the Americans took for granted. For Japanese pilots, one engine failure over the ocean usually meant death or capture. For American pilots, it often meant a long but survivable ride home on the other propeller. The small lesson is clear. Technology is only as strong as the system that sustains it. The P-38 was not just a machine, it was part of a larger machine called American industry, where factories, supply ships, and maintenance crews worked in harmony to keep men alive. And this harmony extended beyond combat. The P-38 was more than a fighter, it became the eyes of the Pacific War. Stripped of its guns and fitted with cameras, it transformed into the F-5 reconnaissance variant, capturing images that shaped entire campaigns. That is where we turn next, to the silent war of photography, where the Lightning revealed Japanese secrets long before the first bomb ever fell. 9. Reconnaissance, the silent war of the F-5 Lightning. In war, victory often belongs not to the side with the loudest guns, but to the side with the clearest eyes. The P-38 Lightning, already feared as a fighter, carried another secret identity. Stripped of its weapons and outfitted with high-resolution cameras, it became the F-5, the unarmed scout that quietly changed the course of battles. From the Solomon Islands to the Philippines, F-5 Lightnings flew long, lonely missions deep over enemy territory. They carried no bombs, no guns, only cameras mounted in the nose. Yet those lenses captured more than photographs. They captured the beating heart of Japan's empire, airfields carved into coral, shipping convoys snaking across blue seas, fuel depots hidden in palm groves. One famous series of photos taken by F-5 Seconds in 1943 revealed the Japanese buildup at Rabaul. What commanders saw in those images, rows of aircraft, anti-aircraft positions, supply dumps, allowed them to plan strikes with deadly precision. American bombers knew exactly where to hit, because a Lightning had already flown there, unseen, days before. For Japanese pilots, the frustration was crushing. They often scrambled to intercept the intruder, but the F-5 Seconds flew so high and so fast that Zeros could barely reach them. Many reconnaissance pilots recalled looking down through their canopy, watching angry swarms of Japanese fighters struggling thousands of feet below, powerless to stop the silent camera that recorded their every weakness. The small lesson here is simple. Information is a weapon. While the Zero was designed to dominate duels of skill, the Lightning was part of a different philosophy. It didn't just fight, it watched, measured, and prepared the battlefield. In many ways, the F-5's photographs destroyed more Japanese strength than the Lightning's guns ever did. And this thread ties back to something bigger. America's war machine wasn't just about brave pilots or clever tactics. It was about an entire industrial system that could produce, adapt, and innovate faster than Japan could ever hope to match. In our next chapter, we'll step back from the cockpit to the factory floor, where the true scale of the industrial arsenal behind the Lightning becomes clear. 10. Industrial Arsenal. Why America could always build better. Behind every Lightning that rose into the Pacific skies stood not just a pilot, but an entire nation's factories, workers, and supply chains. This was the hidden battlefield of World War II, the Industrial War. And here, Japan never had a chance. Between 1941 and 1945, Lockheed produced over 10,000 P-38 seconds. Each one rolled out of Burbank's assembly lines with engines, turbo superchargers, propellers, radios, and hydraulics built to precise standards. Components were interchangeable. A mechanic in New Guinea could swap out an Allison engine in hours because it fit exactly as the one removed. In contrast, Japan built about 10,000 Zeros over the entire course of the war, often with declining quality. Aluminum became scarce, engines were hand-fitted, and many parts required careful adjustments before they worked properly. By 1944, shortages meant aircraft left factories with weaker alloys, less reliable systems, and fewer refinements. The difference was not just quantity, it was quality. The scale of American industry was staggering. While Japanese engineers struggled to handcraft solutions, Lockheed engineers churned out upgrades, hydraulically boosted ailerons, dive recovery flaps, improved cockpit heating. Every few months, the P-38 evolved, each model stronger than the last. Japanese pilots faced essentially the same Zero in 1945 that had attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. Lightning pilots, meanwhile, climbed into aircraft that felt entirely new. The small lesson here is that wars are won not only in the skies but also on the factory floor. America's system of continuous improvement meant that every pilot who strapped into a Lightning flew the latest version of a design that never stopped advancing. Japan's rigid structures and lack of resources meant their pilots fought yesterday's war with yesterday's machines, and the gap was only widening. Because while Japan struggled to keep aircraft flying, American squadrons also refined their tactics, turning the Lightning into a weapons system Japan could never quite counter. That brings us to the next part of our story. The Japanese counter-moves their desperate attempts to fight back, and why every one of them ultimately failed. 11. Japanese counter-moves and failures. When the first reports of the Lightning reached Japanese command, disbelief was common. A twin-engined fighter that could climb like a Zero? Impossible. But by 1943, disbelief had turned into desperation. Something had to be done. At Rabaul and Truk, Japanese squadrons experimented with countermeasures. Pilots were told to dive straight down, using speed to force the heavy P-38 to overshoot. Others were instructed to lure the Americans into low-altitude turning fights, where the Zero could still out-twist any opponent. Loose formations were tried, spreading fighters at different altitudes to watch for attacks from above. Sometimes these tactics worked briefly. A careless Lightning pilot who lingered in a turn could still find himself in the crosshairs of a Zero. But more often, the results were the same. The P-38's superior climb and dive allowed it to disengage at will, while its concentrated nose guns punished even the smallest mistake. There was also an attempt at innovation. Dive brakes were fitted to some Zeros, meant to give them control in high-speed descents. But without the engine power or rugged structure of the Lightning, these modifications brought little relief. Japan even began designing new twin-engined fighters, like the Kawasaki Ki-102. Yet these prototypes came too late and too few to matter. The lesson here is that adaptation without resources is often just improvisation. Japan had brilliant pilots and engineers, but no industrial system to support radical change. America, meanwhile, adjusted every few months, introducing new Lightning variants that erased any temporary advantage. For Japanese aviators, the battlefield became increasingly one-sided. Every new tactic seemed to end the same way: lightnings appearing out of the sun, diving fast, and climbing away untouched. And for the men inside those cockpits, the cost was not just tactical, it was human. Because by 1944, Japan's most experienced pilots were gone, replaced by boys with barely enough hours to fly. The human cost of this imbalance tells the next chapter of our story. 12. The human cost, from aces to recruits with no chance. By 1944, the cockpits of Japanese fighters told a heartbreaking story. The veterans who had once carried the rising sun across the skies, men like Saburo Sakai and Junichi Sasai, were gone, killed, wounded, or reassigned. In their place came boys barely out of school, rushed through a shortened training program and handed the controls of aircraft they hardly understood. Some had fewer than 100 hours of flight time when they met the enemy. Many had never practiced a gunnery burst with live ammunition. Letters recovered after the war revealed their private fears. One young pilot wrote to his mother, "Tomorrow, I face the twin-tailed devil. They fly higher and faster than we can imagine. I will do my duty, but I do not expect to return." He never did. Across the Pacific, the story looked very different. American pilots arrived in theater with twice the training, often 400 to 600 flight hours, and veterans shared lessons openly. In P-38 squadrons, gun camera films were studied after every mission, so that even rookies learned from the mistakes and successes of others. This system meant each new pilot was not starting from zero, he was standing on the shoulders of those who came before him. The result was devastating. Japan lost not only aircraft but also the precious experience of skilled aviators. Each zero that went down took with it knowledge that could never be replaced. Meanwhile, American pilots like Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire accumulated scores that dwarfed their opponents, protected by machines that gave them every advantage. The small lesson here is sobering. Technology widens the gap, but human preparation determines survival. America produced professionals. Japan produced sacrificial lambs. And behind every lopsided dogfight lay the tragedy of young lives wasted, thrown into battles they could not hope to win. Yet the Lightning's story did not end with combat alone. Its impact went deeper, reshaping not only tactics and morale, but the very culture of war itself. And that takes us to our final chapter, the legacy of the P-38 Lightning, the end of the Samurai Sky era, and the lesson Japan would carry long after the war had ended. 13. Legacy of the Lightning, end of the Samurai Sky era. When Japanese pilots first saw the P-38's twin tails glinting in the Pacific sun, they thought it looked strange, even clumsy. By the end of the war, that silhouette had become something else entirely, a symbol of fear, inevitability, and change. For Japan, the Lightning shattered a worldview. The Zero had been built on the belief that courage and skill could triumph over all. The P-38 proved otherwise. Its speed, range, firepower, and adaptability revealed that modern war belonged not to the lone warrior but to the nation that could build, innovate, and sustain. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most celebrated ace, later admitted, "The P-38 destroyed the morale of the Zero fighter pilot. We met the future, and it destroyed us." For America, the Lightning became a stepping stone to something larger. Its lessons about high-altitude combat, long-range navigation, and continuous improvement would echo into the jet age. The men who flew it, Richard Bong, Thomas Maguire, and hundreds of others, carried its legacy into the Cold War, where speed and technology again defined survival. The small lesson here is timeless. Innovation is not just about machines, but about mindsets. The P-38 story reminds us that tradition without adaptation becomes a weakness, while courage paired with progress becomes unstoppable. And perhaps the most human legacy of all lies in the silence that followed. When the guns fell quiet, when the Pacific once again reflected only clouds and seabirds, those who survived were left to wonder. Japanese pilots looked back and saw the end of the samurai in the sky. American pilots looked back and saw proof that industry, science, and teamwork could change the course of history. In the end, the twin-tailed devil was more than a fighter. It was a messenger of a new era, the end of one way of war and the beginning of another. An era where victory belonged not to the most daring individual, but to the nation that could see farther, climb higher, and never stop improving.